if, for those of you who watched the 601 check-in, you already know that I am speaking today on the story of Eve, which Ansel just read a little bit ago. And I referred to it in that video as the incident with the snake and the fruit. And mostly it's because of my own stubbornness. I don't like to call this story the fall, which is what it normally gets titled. And I think the incident is better. I like it. So I'm going to coin that. It's no longer the fall of mankind, it's the incident. But part of that is like, this story has 2,000 years of Christian theology behind it that may or may not reflect the actual message of why it was written in the first place. Because depending on when you date the book of Genesis, this story is much older than Christianity. And the story is one that is added to the book of Genesis as a collection of Israel's narratives that they listen to, and it's part of their history. Most ancient societies have these more mythical type stories, and this is one of Israel's. So we kind of need to take a step back, and if you will, bear with me. Let's try our hardest to forget the last 2,000 years of Christian theology on this passage, because I think that there's been some things that have happened, and I think we've used some of the ways that the New Testament interprets this passage to interpret it for ourselves. And it's one of those things, like when Paul uses the story, Paul is writing something about Jesus. Paul's not actually writing a theology of how we should understand Genesis 3, he's writing a theology about Jesus. And sometimes I think we've taken that and pushed it back too far and be like, this is the correct understanding that everyone has always had about Genesis 3, and that's not necessarily the case. And actually, when we look at the rest of the Old Testament, this story is very rarely brought up. It's very rarely mentioned. The garden is mentioned a couple times, but really the fall of humanity, it's not something people are thinking about. And I think that there's a reason for that. My biggest my biggest suspicion is that I don't think they necessarily saw it as this tipping point in the story of humanity when everything went awry, and when sin entered the world and nature itself is now corrupted to the point where it's falling apart. I think that those are more modern interpretations of the story that I don't necessarily think the ancient people had in mind. See, the book of Genesis is this book that literally means beginnings. Like, it is the story of Israel. This is what they are taking with them as becoming a nation. And they're using this as their set of wisdom that they're going to use as they try to be the nation of God. And so we need to understand it in that light. Because the story isn't just a story about what happened in a garden. This is a story of Israel about to be the nation of Yahweh, and they're using their stories to provide wisdom to their people. And so we look at the story of Israel, and the thing that they are told to be careful about the most is the influence of the Canaanites around them and the influence of worshiping other gods. And I think when we start to look at it under this light, for the purpose of why this was written, we will start to see that this story actually says a lot more than what we've given it credit for. Because if this is a story of wisdom, if it's a work of poetry, a work of art that communicates wisdom to people, then it should work for more than one setting. And I think that's what we'll see today. So to set up Genesis 3, and specifically the story of Eve, we gotta take a moment and just look at some of these like key phrases that are super important that people have argued about what they mean. So the first one is the knowledge of good and evil. And I don't know a single theologian that says this is exactly what it means. Unfortunately, I'm going to end up doing that to you today. But take that to mean that this is my best understanding. So whenever we have a phrase or a word or something we just don't understand, the first thing we should do is go see how it's used elsewhere in the Old Testament. And when we look at the knowledge of good and evil, we actually find that it is elsewhere in the Old Testament. In particularly in Deuteronomy chapter 1, when Moses is giving his speech to the nation of Israel before they go into the promised land, he tells the people that their little ones and their children that don't yet know or don't yet have the knowledge of good and evil. So let's break that down. The little ones is actually a phrase of anyone 21 or younger. So it's not necessarily little ones, it's more just younger people, under 21. Then the second group, children who don't yet have the knowledge of good and evil, and that is contrasts with little ones. And remember, little ones goes up to 21, which means this contrast with the second group is probably younger. So what we're dealing with is not necessarily the knowledge of sin and righteousness. What we're dealing with is maturity. Because, as many of you know who have been around children tend to lack maturity. They tend to lack these basic elements of knowledge of, we might say, of good and evil. And so this phrase represents that it represents maturity. It represents the wisdom that comes with age. Because those little ones in the other category, which goes up to age 21, they already have that knowledge. They have gained that wisdom of age. This phrase is also used of kings in 2 Samuel and 1 Kings for a king who is able to decipher between good and evil, which is a representation of his wisdom and be able to bring about justice. So when we start out with Genesis 2 and 3 and we see that there's a tree of knowledge of good and evil, and what does it mean that Adam and Eve don't yet have the knowledge of good and evil? If we let the Bible interpret that term for us, it means that they haven't gained the wisdom of maturity. It means that mentally, they're children. Now, in the garden, they're supposed to interact with God, and as we see throughout the Old Testament, interacting with God is something that brings wisdom. And being invited into this garden, they will gain wisdom if they follow God and listen to God. So it's not like they're these children that are just put there that are just going to be children forever. It's kind of this invitation to grow and learn with God. Now, Adam and Eve, this immaturity is actually highlighted at the end of chapter 2, whenever it says that they were naked and unashamed. And in an ancient mindset, being naked was something to be shameful of. However, as anyone who has been around a toddler knows, a toddler can be naked and unashamed. Like, there is a level of innocence within a child when they just pull off their diaper and go running. Like, most of us as adults won't do that because we have some maturity, we have some wisdom, and children just don't have that. So chapter 2 ends with Adam and Eve in this perfect state of innocence and immaturity. But then we get to chapter 3, and the snake shows up. Now it's interesting, so many translations have tried to get a correct interpretation of the word used for the snake. The one that we read today, I believe, was crafty, and the one I have here says subtle. So that there's not quite this agreed upon understanding of what the snake is like. But in English, we're missing a wordplay. See, the Hebrew word for naked in the end of chapter 2 is arom. But the word used for the snake is arum. So just one vowel change, which is quite interesting, because the author is actually setting up this dichotomy. Adam and Eve are arom, but the snake is arum. The snake is the opposite of Adam and Eve. And it's also interesting, whenever this passage was first translated into Greek, the word that is used for the snake is not crafty, it's not any of these words that are negative. It's actually wisdom. It's the exact same word that Jesus uses for wise people in the New Testament. It's the exact same word that Paul uses for wisdom in the New Testament. So they understood this as the snake was wise. Now remember, Adam and Eve didn't have the knowledge of good and evil. They did not have the wisdom of maturity. The snake is the opposite of them. The snake has wisdom. The snake has that maturity. So what we end up seeing when we step into the story is this instance where there's this creature that has wisdom, has power, it has knowledge, and it takes up the opportunity to prey on the innocents. And it takes up the opportunity to abuse the immaturity of Adam and Eve. And the snake goes for Eve. The snake doesn't go towards Adam. So now this is the part where the sermon is specifically over Eve. So we're going to focus on Eve from here on out. And the snake speaks to Eve very respectfully, actually, and is very kind and encourages her to do something that she, being innocent without wisdom, is unable to fully understand. And the snake steps into that. And then after Eve eats of the fruit and Adam eats of the fruit, God shows up. And God is like, what have you done? And there's blame going all over the place. And God gives out these curses, which I think the word curse is actually, we have too much English going on in our head when we read the word curse that kind of isn't necessarily what is meant by the word in the Hebrew. But regardless, when God comes to Eve, there is no curse. It just says, God said, I will, and that's what happens. Now we got to take a moment because we got to span the chasm of our time here, because most of us don't really like the idea of God causing negative things to happen. And I think that's fair, because personally, not all of that understanding is something I find theologically valid. That is a much longer conversation that we can, I'm sure, set up a Zoom call and delve into. But we we gotta remember in the ancient mindset, when we're dealing with cause and effect, there's an understanding that God causes secondary effects. So the example I used in children's church this morning, if William is here and there's people in the congregation, if William and I are talking up in front of here and everyone's watching and I shove William, right? And he falls down, he gets hurt. So in the ancient mindset, I've done something, and there's an effect on William. I am responsible for the effect on William. Now, everyone that just saw me shove William, you're no longer going to trust me around you, first of all. You're going to be like, Kaylee is kind of a hostile person. And so that would be interpreted in a more ancient mindset as God causing those who viewed to now think of me as hostile. So in an ancient mindset, whenever these secondary effects are understood to be caused by God. And so that's the language that we find in this ancient document, is that God is the one who causes this effect. It doesn't necessarily mean that God is the one that forced it to happen, but God is kind of responsible for all cause and effect, which kind of makes sense. I mean, if we believe in a creator that has actually created the world to work in a cause and effect manner, whenever the world actually does work in a cause and effect manner, then it's actually working like God created it to work. So then technically God is the cause of it. But that is all to say that this language here doesn't necessarily mean that we have to understand it as God bringing out a consequence, which is good because when we look at the consequence, it's not exactly something that we would like to associate with God. And again, I think the English translations have a little difficulty here. As much as I hate to say it, the King James Version is actually a better translation of the consequences on Eve, as weird as that is, because most translations say that God will increase the pain of childbirth. The problem is the word pain is more emotional pain. It's not like physical pain. It's like grief. It's the pain that somebody feels whenever somebody dies. And the word that is often translated childbearing isn't the one that's actually meant childbearing. It's actually conception. So God is increasing, or maybe I shouldn't say it that way, the effect on Eve is grief. And the effect on Eve is grief in conceiving. And it goes further. Eve's desire will be for her husband. And that word desire often gets put into this negative context, but actually it's the same word that's used in Song of Songs of the passion between two lovers. So this word desire is not necessarily this evil word. It's this word of desire between two people. But her husband will rule over her. Does this sound familiar to anyone else? Because this isn't the type of consequence that we get for eating fruit. This is the type of effect whenever somebody has gone through sexual abuse. And I'm not the first person to say that. Actually, there's a long history of associating this story with sexual abuse. In fact, a little anecdote, you know the word that gets translated homosexuality in the New Testament, even though Paul created it and nobody else used it for centuries? The first time it's used after Paul used it is in a retelling of Adam and Eve, where that word is used for the snake raping Adam. Just throwing that out there. So like, this understanding of sexual abuse in this story is not new. And unfortunately, this story is not one that is only told once. So a few weeks ago, there was a conference for a major denomination, if you follow stuff like that. And there was debate over whether or not they should have a third-party investigation into sexual abuse allegations. A lot of people didn't want that. And I think we get why when we look at this passage. So let's go all the way back to the snake. It says that the snake was the craftiest of all the animals, of all the wild creatures. But remember, it's not crafty, it's wise. The snake is the wisest of all the creatures. So how many times have sexual abuse survivors been told that what they're saying happened couldn't have happened because of the wisdom or the respect of the person that they're accusing? We see this in college football all the time, where a player is accused of sexual abuse, and the people go against the person who brought up the claim, because obviously this football player or basketball player or whatever couldn't have done that. We've seen this in mega churches a couple times a year for the past few years, where sexual abuse allegations come up against a leader, and people turn on the victim because that leader couldn't have done that. Because the experience of everyone else around them is that that leader is wise, that leader is respectful. And so we turn on the victim. And we see that with Eve. Our theology of Eve has turned on the victim. We've turned Eve into the story of the first sinner. We've turned Eve into this story of how could she? Without taking the time to understand that she was innocent and immature and was taken advantage of. I think the story of Eve has a lot more to say to our time than just where did sin come from. Now I'm going to go back just a little bit further, because like I said at the beginning, this story has a purpose. It had a purpose. The story had a purpose for the nation of Israel. And what we find out when we read further on during the curses that we call them, that there will be animosity between the snake and the descendants of the woman. And later the woman is called the mother of all the living. That's what Eve means. Now take this as the nation of Israel. This is your story. This is where you come from. The nation of Israel is saying that they are the seed of that woman. And they're about to go into the promised land. What does that mean for them going into the promised land? Well, what that means is they are to take up verse 15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, was speaking of the snake, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So what we read here is the nation of Israel is to step into that role of that seed. That they are to step into the role of the wise and the respectful and stand up against them whenever they are taking advantage of those who they can take advantage of. Israel was meant to be a wise nation that reflected the wisdom of Yahweh. And in order to do that, They had to bring about justice. So the story is encouraging them, that them as the seed of the woman, as the descendant of the woman, were to be at constant battle with those who opposed her, with those who seem wise but take advantage of people. So as Christians, as we are continuing this story, we are stepping into that same role. And let's be honest, there's a few people here today. Statistically, multiple people in this room have been sexually abused. Statistically speaking, there's a pretty good chance that there could be an abuser in this room. Statistically speaking, I'm not pointing out anyone here. We're just talking about statistics. Statistically speaking, a church congregation has the same demographics of abusers and victims as the rest of the world, or I guess the rest of the culture. So we're not immune to this. It's something that is part of our story. And there's probably an Eve in this room. Probably multiple. As the church, we step up beside the Eves. We tell them that it's not their fault that they were taken advantage of. It is not their sin to bear. We need to understand that sin doesn't enter into the world because of what the victim did, but because of what the abuser did to the victim. And as Christians, we stand up. We take that role of the descendant of Eve to say, we will not stand for this. It does not matter the wisdom or the respect of the person who did the abusing, because people in those positions take advantage of the innocent. So to be the church, we stand up for the Eves. All power be to the Creator, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Amen.